Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show which discusses any and all topics under the sun from a woman's point of view. Our program believes that women should be treated with respect at all times and in all places. Here's today's moderator, Ty Goodwin.
Hello and welcome to another episode of It's a Woman's World. I am your moderator today, Ty Goodwin, and as always, we have an amazing panel of women today talking about an engaging topic that you will not want to miss. But before we jump into our conversation, let's start by introducing our co-host.
Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Strauss.
I'm Jamila Pettifort.
I'm glad to have both of you here today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
And I am Aline Thani, so happy to be with you all.
So glad you're here. Now let me introduce you to our two guests for today. We have Dr. Ellen Kennedy. She is the Executive Director of World Without Genocide. And we also have Chloe Morris, a fascinating young lady. I can't wait for you all to hear her story. She is a Young Ferenz Fellow in Human Rights and Law at World Without Genocide. Chloe is a senior at St. Paul Academy. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you.
We all have questions. We're going to be talking about child marriage in the U.S. and in Minnesota today. Allie, would you kick us off with our questions?
I will. And the first one I'm thinking about is child marriage. When I heard this in Minnesota, I mean, somewhat maybe in the U.S., but I was really surprised. So can you tell us about this?
Everybody is always shocked. In the United States, between the year 2000 and 2010, 248,000 children got married. I'm going to say that number again. 248,000 children. Children got married in every single state in the U.S. Who is a child? Anyone under the age of 18. Marriages were documented for children as young as 10, 11, and 12.
Wow.
And it's estimated that at least 240 children in Minnesota are getting married every year. Right here in Minnesota.
When they're that young, 10 or 11?
Not that young in Minnesota. The legal age in Minnesota with parental or judicial consent is 16. Without that parental or judicial consent, it's 18. But international law says anyone under 18 is a child.
I can't imagine, though, if somebody got married at 10 or 11. To me, that would seem like child abuse.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm more interested in the parental consent for someone under, the age of 16 or 17. Why?
It's a really compelling question, and there are parents who feel that perhaps their child will be better insured of a safe future. Maybe they're afraid the child will become sexually active, and that might not happen if the child is married off. Maybe the family is in very difficult financial straits, and the parents think, gee, maybe my child will have a better future if she, and occasionally if he, gets married very young. Sometimes a child is pregnant, and the parent feels, I don't want that child to wait until she is an adult to have that right of marriage. I want that child to get married now. There are many different reasons why a parent would want a child to get married.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is.
But we also know that there are no good outcomes for children who get married. And we didn't know that maybe a century ago or maybe a generation ago. But the research today shows that when children get married, anyone under 18, they have a far higher risk of being sexually abused by that spouse, of having divorce, of living in poverty, of raising children who also will have lives of poverty. The situation is dire.
Yeah.
Chloe, what are you doing in this whole area?
Right. I mean, right now I'm working on kind of legislative defying about the bill that's introduced to the legislature that would make the legal minimum age 18. Like you guys said, you were just shocked to know that it existed, and that's kind of the widespread sense that most people have, is they don't know it exists, and when they do find out about it, they're just shocked. And so hopefully we can take that momentum and then also funnel it into some action.
So how did you get curious about this, or why are you so passionate about this topic?
Ellen introduced me to the topic about a year ago, right around International Women's Day, and she came to my school and actually did a presentation about child marriage, and that was just so eye-opening for me. And I think for me as a 17-year-old, I'm surrounded by so many women and other teenagers who are just making decisions about their life right now and kind of thinking about their future.
What's the youngest age of a child in Minnesota that's gotten married?
Well, they're not allowed to get married legally under the age of 16. Now that's legally. We don't have any way to document marriages that are occurring outside of the legal arena. So we don't know.
Can you explain what that means, marriages outside of the legal arena? What is
Well,
that?
there can be unofficial marriages within a community. There can be cohabitation, for example, that people might view as an unofficial marriage. We have no idea the extent of that.
You know, I just think about again here, thinking about what are some of the underlying thinking about this. And what I mean by that is when we think of a child, right, we think of they're still developing cognitively, their bodies are still developing. We think about a 10-year-old versus a 16-year-old. I think in a general societal sense, we might think, well, that 16-year-old looks more like an adult, so maybe that's a little bit more palatable. You know, they're starting to look, but that 10-year-old,
Yeah.
you know, so when we think about these marriages, if we take women as an example, if there are the men that are marrying, are we talking about men who are close to their age? Are we talking about men that are like much older? Can you give us a little insight into that?
In general, we're talking primarily of those children who marry, that close to 90% of them are girls. So let's use the assumption that we're talking about girls. And many of them are marrying males who are significantly older than they are. So if it were not for the cover of being married, the resulting sexual relationship would be the crime of statutory rape.
And are these men, Ellen, I'm sorry, I just want to ask this question. It's not the nicest question, but are these men, or do they have predatory behaviors?
Many of them do, and some of the people who do a lot of the research in this field actually are labeling this a form of trafficking. And I think we need to view it that way, because trafficking implies that the woman or girl, or in some cases men or boys, are trapped in that situation. And that's exactly what child marriage is. And I think Chloe defined it so well. That girl has no recourse, not even to be able to check herself into a hospital without an adult being there. And if the parents had signed on to that marriage, it's unlikely that she will have parents willing to do that. So who is the adult to whom she has to turn? It's that male who in all likelihood is also an abuser.
And Chloe, can you tell us then a little bit about the law, this Minnesota law? What are the elements of the law? And what could we do, if anything, to help get it passed?
Yeah, well, the law as it is right now is the minimum age is 18, but with exceptions, the minimum age is 16. So that means that with judicial consent or parental consent, people 16 and older can also get married. And right now, that means that what we can do is just raise awareness in our community, try to get people to understand this issue so that we can have more people who bring it to their legislators and call their representatives or their senators, write to them and let them know that the community cares about this and that we want to see child marriage banned.
I think it's important for people to understand that our country is not able to make a law that covers the entire country regarding child marriage. And that's because marriage is left up to the jurisdiction of individual states. So it's a little bit different state by state by state. And right now there are 2 states that have banned all child marriage, no exceptions, Delaware and New Jersey. Those laws were just passed in 2018.
Wow.
People are finally learning about this issue. They're learning about the fact that children should not have children, that children should be children. And this issue now is coming up in more and more state legislatures. So we want people to talk about it. As Chloe said, be aware that we must protect our children, all of our children.
And Chloe, with being a young Ferenz Fellow in Human Rights and all of the wonderful things that you are doing as a young woman, how do you see this playing out for you in taking action in your school, in your community, and all of the different various accomplishments you've already, done so far?
Well, what I hope right now is just to get people at my school really talking about it, and that when I raise awareness or host programs with presentations about it, that they show up, and that hopefully we can also get more youth involved, because I think the youth voice is especially powerful. First, just that legislators like to hear that young people are involved and like to hear what they have to say, because it's more unique, and then also this issue specifically pertains to youth.
Yes.
And I think that in terms of my community, I also just want my community to get involved, to also have like adults supporting the youth as we call our legislators and meet with them and try to let them know that we really do care about this.
Are you using mediums of television, radio?
Yeah,
Social
so
media?
far,
Okay.
yeah, I did a radio show talking about this, and right now, and then programs like at Highland Park Public Library that are free and open to the public. So posting kind of flyers about that and trying paper flyers, so that people will just see them in person. Right, yeah.
So what kind of a response are you getting? First of all, I know St. Paul Academy, students that attend there are pretty bright kids. And so I tend to stereotype, I might be wrong, that there is a sense of maturity with the kids that attend there. And some schools, of course, the kids are a broader range in terms of their maturity levels and their intellect and their engagement with school activities. So let me ask you, with St. Paul Academy then, and I'm stereotyping that you all are kind of, an elite group of young people, what kind of a result, or response rather, are you getting from your classmates? And then when you talked about going into the community, what kind of response are you getting from community members?
I think that from my classmates, it's kind of a similar reaction again, like you had, just what? Not fully comprehending that, oh, this does happen right here. And I think that's really powerful. But what's also harder is getting people to kind of move past that and start taking action on it. I think, as students, we're all kind of busy, and people have their interest and their focus. And so what I'm hoping to do is try to get them to kind of move past that astonishment and start thinking about what they can do as young people. And then in my community, I think, again, it's similar, kind of that sense of shock, but not exactly sure how to proceed. And it's harder to reach out to people in the community on an individual level, because at school I can just talk to people and be like, hey, you call your senator about this. But hopefully that by just raising awareness on a larger scale, people will be more driven to do that. And also by raising awareness in my school and having students talking to their parents and parents talking to their friends, it can kind of create more of a network of knowledge.
That's fantastic. Well, we've got to wrap up this first segment.
No.
I know we'll have to have you come back. It was so intriguing.
thank you.
But I want to thank you to Dr. Ellen Kennedy, and I also want to thank you to Chloe Morris. Thank you so much for your time today. And we'll be back with part 2 of this conversation. Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation on child marriage in the U.S. and in Minnesota. And I am excited because we have 2 new guests that have joined us. We have Abigail Henjek. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
And we have Ashlyn Kenzier.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Both Abigail and Ashley, they're both Ferenz Fellows in Human Rights, and they both work with the Gender Justice. So thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what kind of work are the 2 of you doing around the topic of child marriage?
So one of the things we're doing is, like Chloe was saying, a lot of public education and outreach because people don't realize that this is an issue. So last week we were featured on a radio show with Dr. Kennedy and Chloe and State Senator Sandy Pappas talking about this issue. And then Abigail and I have also done a bunch of presentations just educating people about the issue.
Are there certain groups that call you and say, we want to hear what you have to say, or are you doing outreach yourself?
I think it kind of depends. So we've spoken to the Human Rights Committee at the Minnesota State Bar Association because we're connected with them, and it kind of just depends on who is looking for speakers, and then people like Chloe who are just putting together presentations for their community.
Okay, okay. So what are you doing with it? I mean, you're with gender justice. I know, Ashlyn, you're already an attorney, and Abigail, you're almost
so close,
there.
yeah, so far away.
Yes, the bar is always looming, isn't
Right,
it?
yeah.
So, but tell us what you're doing, and is this via gender justice, or is it via the World Without Genocide? Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so we are both fellows for World Without Genocide, and it's through that capacity that we're working on this issue.
Okay.
In the area of child marriage, what is the demographic in Minnesota that kind of makes up this child marriage mostly here?
So unfortunately, Minnesota is one of 12 states that does not keep any data on this. If we wanted to gather data, we would have to individually call every county and gather that data and have their county clerks looking for it.
Okay.
So we don't know how many children are getting married or the demographics. We do know from studying other states that it cuts across all cultures, all religions, and things like that. Probably the biggest factor leading to child marriage is poverty.
Why do you think that this has not been talked about? It feels like it's been swept under the rug and no one keeps data on it. So you know that when people don't keep data, they don't really think of it as important. Why is that?
I think in America we tend to think of child marriage as something that happens in faraway places.
Third world.
Yes, and that's a little bit perpetuated by our federal government stance on child marriage, which we do have an anti-child marriage foreign policy stance, and so I think people kind of just assume that, you know, if we're going to tell other people not to have child marriage, that we kind of have our own system in check, and unfortunately that's not really the case.
What is our foreign policy on it? I mean, I guess I don't know.
Yeah, so the federal government acknowledges the ways in which child marriage harms people involved in the institution. Children who get married are more likely to suffer from complicated or dangerous pregnancies and childbirths. They are more likely to get a wide range of diseases. They're at higher risk for stroke and cancer. They are at higher risk for domestic violence. They're less likely to finish high school or go to college.
Yeah.
And the federal government acknowledges those wide-ranging impacts that it has on children from a foreign policy stance, but the federal government hasn't quite gotten there in a domestic sense yet.
And when we think about this topic and like sweeping it under the rug, you know, when you hear, well, maybe it's because of their religion, or maybe it's because, well, even if, you know, their parents signed off on it, what do I have to care about that business? So why should people care? Why should they not stop after hearing, oh, it's probably because of their religious reasons, and don't they have a right?
So one of the things that we've been lucky enough to do is talk to some state senators and representatives in the states where they have formally banned child marriage, and we've talked about some of these issues. Like, why is it so important? People say, don't you have a right? Like, what if there are two 17-year-olds and one person's going into the military? Shouldn't they have a right? Well, first of all, only 14% of child marriages are actually between two people who are under the age of 18. But one of the things we've heard is a delayed right is not a denied right. So the fact that we delay your right to vote until you're 18 years old isn't us denying your right to vote. We're waiting until you have developed a sense of maturity in order to make a conscientious decision as to who you're going to vote for. And marriage shouldn't be any different than that. So that's one of the things I think is absolutely imperative to understand, is that we're not looking to deny people the right to get married. We're waiting until they are mature enough to make that decision on their own and to not have their parents or a judge involved.
And kind of what we were talking about before with Chloe in the past segment was the behavior of some of the folks that are getting married. They are older men, maybe more predatory, dealing in the sex trafficking, kind of, masking the sex trafficking by being married. Kind of speak to that, when it comes to, is this kind of the driving force as to why this is so important, and this is something that we need to really deal with?
I think it is kind of exactly how you explained it. It's like, I like to think of it as like a blanket that traffickers can hide behind, because if these people weren't married, this would be behavior that everyone knows is against the law and just wrong.
Exactly.
But now we're going to legally sanction it once they get married. It becomes something that is acceptable. They don't have to hide. It also gives a lot of tools to the trafficker to use. So one example is if someone is trying to get out of a bad situation and they buy a bus ticket to California, they're like, I have to get out of here. The credit card company, the bus company, they're not going to release information to just some guy, but they very well may release information to her husband.
Wow.
And so it helps keeps tabs. It helps them in immigration laws, often based on family ties. So even just in the physical element, it helps them get people physically where they want them.
You made a comment that it's more acceptable if a marriage occurs. Can you talk about that? Who is it acceptable to? I'm not following that particularly.
So one of the cases I'd like to tell us about is the case of Sherry Johnson in Florida. So she was raped multiple times while she was under the age of 10. She gave birth when she was 10 years old to her rapist child. And when she was 11, her parents married her off to her rapist, who was a 20-year-old deacon at their church. Why it became acceptable and why they decided to do that was because there was a Child Protective Services investigation. And Child Protective Services stopped investigating the church and the family once there was a marriage because it was considered legally sanctioned. And it's kind of similar to prosecutors. They don't want to interrupt what is considered the family unit. So prosecutors won't go after these cases because they think of it as interrupting a family, despite the fact that there is rampant abuse going on.
You said the parents agreed to have her married?
Yes, the parents were the ones who did that.
Now, when we speak about the children and the child, so say for instance, if it is a younger girl, she's 14, she's 15, she has a child, or she's found to be pregnant by the family. Oftentimes people might say, well, it's better for the child because they'll have insurance or they'll have a certain level of protection because they're married now. Maybe speak to that. Are there ways out for, younger women who do get pregnant and they want to protect the child? Are there different ways or maybe different recourse that they can take to not be married? Is there, other opportunities or?
I'd say the number one thing to know is that marriage isn't the only option that you have. You have other support systems. In terms of healthcare, a lot of people do say you should get married because then you will have your husband or spouse's health insurance. But we did find out that that child would automatically be eligible for medical assistance through the state of Minnesota, so they would have at least some medical coverage.
Good to know.
So that you don't have to get married in order to secure that coverage.
Nice, that's good to know.
Another thing I wanted to ask you is, we're making kind of the assumption that, let's say if it's the young girl, like you said, 14, 15, in a marriage, and maybe her parents signed her over. I mean, the magnitude and the enormity of that child having to weigh that decision. Well, my parents, who are supposed to love and protect me, have signed me over and said this is the right thing to do. So can you speak to that? How do you help a child like that when, everything is almost against them? The very people that are supposed to protect and love them have signed them over.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that people kind of struggle with in this issue is, we live in a country where we really like to say like freedom, and people don't want to entrench on that. So there's always kind of the thought of like, well, if, she didn't tell the judge she didn't want to get married, she didn't tell her parents, like she consented. And I think it's really important to realize like these children, they're children. These are young girls. And so, if you try to think back to when you were 14 and your parents were like, this is what's best for you, this is what you need to do to, you know, get where you want to go in life. Like, what, you know, 13, 14-year-old girl is, I think it's rare that you have a 13, 14-year-old girl who's going to be able to stand up and say no, and I'm going to like call you out in front of a a judge. There's just a lot of pressure. You've got your whole life to listen to your parents.
Well, you think of the confidence at that age, right? And the self-esteem. I mean, all those issues that go on at that young age.
I was thinking that this was another thing in our history that we kind of overlooked too, because this has been going on for years. I don't know if you all remember the movie The Color Purple.
Yes.
And in the beginning scenes of that movie, you know, the dad is, you know, thinking about marrying her off to this guy. And so that's always been a part of our history, and I think it's one of those things we kind of do want to keep quiet about, because we haven't always had clean hands. Like you said, we can tell other countries, but have we really checked ourselves with those kinds of things? So I'm glad you are being advocates for this.
Do you know, I know in some other countries, because of poverty, when they marry off a daughter, there's a dowry. Do you know if in the U.S. or in Minnesota, when we have marriages of girls, is there any dowry that exchanges hands as a result?
I think it depends on the culture or the religion. It's not something that would be marked by the judges or anything like that. And like I said, we don't have any data on that, so it'd be extremely difficult to mark that down. And as Dr. Kennedy said, we're also not keeping track of cultural or religious-only marriages that occur outside of the law. So it might be happening in a greater prevalence in those situations as well.
So is there any plan then to, I know you said you'd have to contact every single county, is there any plan to do that and start gathering some baseline data?
So originally that was the plan, was that we wanted to do all of that grunt work and get information, and then Senator Pappas and Dr. Kennedy decided that wasn't good enough. Getting the information is just going to confirm what we already know, and is that hundreds of young girls and young boys are getting married in the state of Minnesota. So what we're doing is trying to pass a bill, hopefully this session, that will make child marriage illegal in the state of Minnesota.
That's
What
great.
luck do you think you'll have? Who are the authors of the bill?
Senator Pappas and Representative Hare. So she's a freshman coming in, and there is a hearing scheduled for this Tuesday, so we are very hopeful.
That's great.
And you'll be there.
Yes, I will be there, and I will be testifying in favor of the bill.
Good.
So moving forward, what can people do to become more aware? Because I think awareness is like the big first step. If we don't know about it, we can't do anything. So what avenues or, you know, what platforms are there so people can become more aware about this?
There's information on the World Without Genocide website. World Without Genocide also hosts a number of these kind of community talks that we have been speaking at, and that information, if you want to find one of those talks in your neighborhood or as close as you can get, would be on the World Without Genocide website as well.
Okay, that's fantastic, fantastic. This has been an intriguing conversation and enlightening too. Thanks so much to our guest today for sharing, and thanks to my fantastic co-host. It's been another brilliant conversation, and with that, we will see you next time on It's a Woman's World.